We have joined the mythic first humans as they stood at an inflection point. Their way of life had abruptly come to an end, and they were entering into a whole new, strange kind of world. We often speak of this story as the fall, when humans sinned and all of creation was impacted. That's certainly there to find. You don't have to dig too deep to find it. But I'd like to come at this story from a little bit different approach today than looking at the fall. I'd like us to consider Adam and Eve's banishment from Eden as the story not only of humanity's frailty and failure, but it's also one of resilience and life after things have fallen apart. To do so, I'm going to lean on the help of this lovely and awfully challenging book by Brian McLaren entitled Life After Doom: Wisdom and Courage for a World Falling Apart. I promise I don't get any kickbacks if you buy this book later, but it's been helpful for me. I started to see the connection between what McLaren suggests for life in this precarious world and Adam and Eve's post-garden story as soon as I read of McLaren's definition of doom, the key starting point in his book. He says that doom is this: a pre-traumatic stress response that arises when our old normal is deteriorating, but no new normal has yet come into view. McLaren goes on to clarify doom. It's not a single catastrophic event, but the emotional and intellectual experience shared by all who realize the dangerous future into which we are plunging ourselves, our descendants, and our fellow creatures. Adam and Eve, in that moment of leaving Eden for an unknown and uncertain new world, could be defined as the first moment of doom on record. No doubt, for many of us, we find ourselves in the midst of a moment of doom, too. Could be the result of a dramatic personal change in life, a divorce, loss of a job, death of a loved one, or some other kind of life-altering event. But it could be something broader than that, too. We may feel doom if we opened our phone and read the recent reports that many countries are failing to meet their commitments to curb climate change. And our own country pulled out of the Paris Agreement entirely and abandoned our efforts to do our part. You may have felt doom each time you open the paper again and read of the daily dismantling of our federal and our state governments. Don't get me wrong, they were flawed to start. But it seems that the most vulnerable among us are the perpetual victims of whatever this progress is that we're going through right now. For some, the sense of doom may have started a long time ago when you were first confronted with the fact that 9 nations on this planet have nuclear arsenals. There are enough weapons that could wipe out all living things on this planet. And we put a lot of trust in a handful of people to not do that. I'm not trying to incite fear among us today, nor am I trying to be a downer in our midst. But if you're sensing doom, uncertain of what comes next, it's not an entirely unreasonable perspective to hold. For that reason, I think there's a benefit from considering the wisdom here, as well as the ways that Adam and Eve set out when they went eastward from Eden. In this book, and I'm just going to scratch the surface here, but McLaren suggests there are 4 movements and attitudes that we can engage as we experience doom. And we can do so in a healthy way. And interestingly, I would suggest that each of these movements, attitudes, are evident in Adam and Eve too. When we sense pending doom, Maclaren suggests we learn to let go, to let be, to let come, and to set free. I want to say a bit more about each of those, but again, I'm only scratching the surface. But also, if you buy this book, I'm not getting any kickback for it. Letting go is facing reality as it is. Letting go is abandoning illusionment. It's resisting the things that desensitize us to what is happening. It might be mindless forms of entertainment or doom scrolling or substances that numb the senses and so on. It's letting those things go so that we can be here. Letting go is exactly that. It's doing the hard work of being present, even when that seems scary. Letting go is recognizing that it's healthier to admit and face what is rather than pretending that it is not. Indeed, for people of faith, letting go is an act of courage and an act of faith. As Adam and Eve left Eden, they didn't fight it. They didn't try to take on those guards at the door. They didn't go around looking for a hole in the fence where they might be able to make their way through. They didn't give up at all. Instead, only one verse later, we read enough today, didn't we? But if we had kept going, we would have realized that they kept going. One verse later, they had fulfilled what God had called them to do back in the garden. Eve became the mother of two sons, Cain and Abel. As we heard, though, that was going to take on a new form of pain than they would have experienced in the garden. Nonetheless, through pain, they welcomed the blessing of new life. In the midst of this new yet already pained world. As scary as it can seem, to look into the face of our current predicaments, it is still a beautiful act of courage and faithfulness to look up, to be present in the midst of it, and to foster life and well-being in all the ways that we can. As we learn to let go, Maclaren invites us to let be. Now, that's a movement or a place of new insight and understanding that leads us to adjust so that we can sustain life in new ways. Letting be includes listening to new voices. For instance, to pay attention to indigenous people who have figured out how to survive through precarious times in the past. With this, to also hear familiar voices in new ways for new insights and new understandings. I might suggest reading the story of Adam and Eve not as one of failure, but as one of resilience might be an example. As we pay attention, we can open ourselves to new understandings. Although Genesis only suggests it, we can presume that Adam worked the ground of this world east of Eden, sustaining life by tilling that ground or hunting, maybe both. Otherwise, the family, apart from the lushness of Eden, would have starved to death. We know whatever Adam did, that Cain was a hunter, Abel was a shepherd. But not only did they learn how to survive, they also gained insights about God that they would have never learned had they stayed in the garden. As Adam and Eve were about to be banished from that garden for good, God made for them garments that covered their bodies, and to keep this newfound sense of shame at bay. Now, indeed, it would have been nice if they had never needed such covering. It would be nice if shame was not a human experience at all. It would be great if we could feel at home in these bodies. And yet, there's plenty to learn about God from the kindness of that act of covering them. They would have never learned that facet of God had they stayed in the garden. Letting be is an act of acceptance, but it's also one that allows us to notice beauty and goodness in the surprising and broken places of this life. And as we let go of what was and gain new insight from letting be, we begin to let come, which is the way McLaren simply names becoming more resilient. Now, the first family's story is one marked with tragedy. In the midst of toil, childbirth's pain, the loss of an egalitarian kind of relationship, they also found the joy of the new life of 2 sons. But of course, that story ended in its own kind of pain as Cain, in the midst of his jealousy, murdered his brother Abel. And then Cain, like mom and dad, was also banished from the land he loved and made a wanderer. That could have been the end of Adam and Eve's story. And yet, we learn it wasn't much later that they had another son, Seth. Part of resiliency is knowing that endings are not the end, and that doom does not mean that the story is over. In fact, resilience makes new stories possible. As we set free, resilience takes shape, and we begin a new stage of agile engagement in the world. We recognize beauty in what is broken, and there's a sense that in such times like the ones we find ourselves, the ones where Adam and Eve might have been, the times that people have experienced throughout history, what we choose to say or not say in times like this matters a lot. It matters a great deal how we conduct ourselves in important times like this. In times like this, as it was with the first humans, the next decisions that we make, both as individuals and collectively as a people, will shape what is possible next. As with Adam and Eve as they left Eden, doom is not the end of the story. In fact, it was only chapter 3 of a story that's still unfolding in our midst. Right now is a time for us to grow in wisdom as we learn how to let go, how to let be, how to let come, and how to set free. Now, McLaren wisely suggests and instructs us to grow stronger in wisdom, kindness, character, interdependence, courage, and agility. We will have to discover new depths of the human spirit. As we were preparing for this series, and I get it, this has been weird so far, right? All right, you're with me. As we were planning for this series on mental health in the midst of a really challenging world, Pastor Ryan and I were thinking through a few different themes, but they didn't seem to quite fit right. But as we kept talking, Pastor Ryan shared a practice used with people he visits with in spiritual direction sessions. He asked people, how is your interior landscape? That language of interior landscape, you've already been introduced to that today, might not be familiar to you. It wasn't to me. It may sound familiar to those who are well-versed in mystic and contemplative traditions, though. But I've been thinking about that question, how is my interior landscape? It took me quickly back to a place where I was in a physical landscape. As I thought on that question, I was reminded of a warm summer afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. Bill Daylong, who I think is joining with us online today, he and I met at Prairie Woods. And we were having a bit of a spiritual direction session. He asked me to wander around the woods a bit, to pay attention to whatever caught my attention. Now, I tried to wander for a while and make this last, but I didn't get too far from the starting point. And it was there that I came upon an old, dead tree trunk. Now, this tree trunk didn't have the precision lines of a cut that had been made by a saw. I suspect the natural breaking point was brought on by a storm, maybe, after years of weather that wore on this tree. I recall being a bit disturbed that this was the thing that drew me in that space. There's all sorts of beauty, living beauty that surrounded me, and this dead thing is what caught my attention. I also knew that after spending a bit of time there, I was going to go back to Bill and he was going to ask me what caught my attention. And explaining that dead tree sounded a little dark, and so I wanted something nicer to have to say. But nonetheless, I remained there. I thought a lot about what could no longer be the case. No new branches stretching into the sky, no new spring buds marking the new life of spring. But as I looked closer, I started to see that this was not a place of death at all, but that it was teeming with new life. It wasn't as obvious as a tree reaching into the sky, but it was no less beautiful nor glorious. I started to notice the scurrying bugs and creepy things that had made their home there. It was like a whole new ecosystem had come to life in this place. As I think back to it now, that moment taught me a lot about the fragility of life, but also the goodness, the tenacity, and the beauty of it as well. I think there were some lessons there about letting go, letting be, letting come, and then setting free. Over the next few weeks, we're going to ask you that you would consider your interior landscapes. You've already started to receive that prompt through the call to worship this morning. Like me, to find what's really inside, you may need to go outside. But whatever it is, pay attention to what is inside. You might even discover the depths of the human spirit within. As we live in the midst of times that seem so precarious, so fragile, may you listen inward, that you too might learn to let go, let be, let come, and set free. Amen.